I just had a birthday and things started breaking. Okay, uh, apparently that's what happens when you get old, and I don't know. I decided. Okay, well, let me explain because I decided I wanted to play football on Thanksgiving. That was very tempting, and so I went out and I thought, you know what? It's going to be no problem. I'll just go out and play some football. I can run around full speed. Wrong answer. Don't do that. Bad idea. I should not have done that, but anyway, since then things have started breaking. So now I got to go see a chiropractor. So I'm going to sit tonight when I talk to you about what we're going to deal with tonight, and I think that it's something that everybody deals with and everybody struggles with, and that is temptation. Right? We deal with temptation probably on a regular. This might be true, right? Everyone has been tempted by someone or something. You've had that friend. You've had that hobby. You've had those types of things that have kind of, at some point made it difficult for you to, or have caused you in some way, maybe to sin. And we would all agree that everybody's tempted. Everybody's tempted to do something they know they shouldn't do. Everybody's tempted to do things that they know they should do, right? We're tempted not to do the things we should do and tempted to do the things we shouldn't do. It doesn't make sense, right? But everybody has been tempted by someone or something in their life, whether or not you've dealt with it or not. But here's what I want to make clear, because I think that sometimes this is a misunderstanding when it comes to this idea of temptation, right? Temptation is not sin. It's going to work for me. There we go. That'll work. Temptation is not sin, right? Temptation is temptation. Temptation is that item that's appealing, or that thing that draws that desire out of you. It's something that we all have. We can be tempted, right? But that temptation is manifested by what we desire. And this idea that we have this want or this need or this thing that is desired within every human being, whether it's some type of sexual desire, whether it's some type of something to do with the feeding of the flesh, if I can phrase it that way, that people have. Every human deals with it. Every human being. And in fact, that's why we sin, right? It's why we deal with sin, because temptation is manifested by the desires that come from within this human being. So let's take a look at these. What's the contrast? What's the difference between what's a temptation and what's a sin? A temptation would be something we might say, well, I could do this, right? I could do this thing. I know I probably shouldn't do this thing, but I really could do this thing. It also might say, I really want to do this. I really have this desire. It's like for me, sweets have always been a temptation. And I've had to cut sweets out of my diet lately, and it's been really hard because my wife likes to make brownies and stuff, and it is really tempting for me to just go walk over there and grab a brownie every 5 minutes because I can just keep eating them, right? It's a temptation for something like that. Or you might have a temptation you might have that friend who just does a lot of bad things, or you might have that cousin or that aunt or that uncle that's just crazy, and they want to do all sorts of crazy stuff all the time and get you into trouble. And even though you know you shouldn't do it, there's this desire to say, hey, I want to experience this. I want to try this. I want to deal with whatever this thing is, even though I know I really shouldn't do it, right? I really want to do this. I really could do this, but I shouldn't do this. And that's what temptation is. It's this desire that is within us, right? And temptation is fed when we want to do something and we know we can't, even though we know we could. I hope that's all making sense. But we might also look at the sense of sin, right? And that sin is something that is acted out. We might say that sin is an immoral act against divine law. We might say that sin is something that goes against God's will. We would say that God says, okay, don't covet, right? And it's not just that we shouldn't desire what other people have. It's the fact that we shouldn't do whatever it takes to get that thing that we really want. Or that we shouldn't have sex before we're married. Because, you know what? It's really tempting, but it's not something that we should do. And God says that it's an immoral act, right? God specifies what is right and what is wrong and what should be done within the marriage relationship and what should not be done outside the marriage relationship. So we would say that sin is an immoral act against divine law, but we might also say that sin is something that we do to ourselves, right? Sin is something that it's not somebody else that makes me sin. It's not somebody else that tells me what I should and shouldn't do, and it's not somebody else that forces me or makes me do something. It's me that does that thing for myself, right? It's something that we do to ourselves. In fact, sin is something that hurts us and it hurts others. In fact, this is what I think the primary existence of why God labeled some of the things sin, he labeled sin. Because you know what? A lot of the sins that we deal with, they hurt us. They not only hurt us, but they hurt other people too, right? Sin affects everybody. It doesn't just affect somebody, it doesn't just affect you or affect your relationship with God, it affects everybody around you, right? And so the difference between sin and temptation is that sin is actually an act you perform. We would say that sin is probably something that we would carry out, right? It's a desire that's carried out by that temptation. And so when we look at James chapter 1 and verse 13, this is what the writer is going to deal with. They have this doctrine in the book of James. And James is written by the brother of Jesus. And he's written these things to the church in Jerusalem in the very early part of Christianity. And he's talking to them. And this style of writing is very Jewish. It's very Jewish in nature. You'll see things that relate a lot to the law and to synagogues. And when they talk about this idea of assembly, they're really dealing with the things that Jewish people are doing and how they're supposed to act corresponding to what Christianity is. And so the first part of this book deals with this idea of how we respond to things. The whole chapter, if you start in chapter 1, verse 2, he deals with trials. Now, trials and temptation in the book of James are actually the same exact word, but they're used in a different sense. And so James uses, here's how you respond to the physical things that happen to you, right? You respond by enduring. You respond by, as a Christian, knowing that you're going to receive a reward. James chapter 1 and verse 12, you're going to receive the crown of life if you endure these trials, these hard things that you're dealing with, and that you need to interact with God and have God help you along the way. And so James, when he gets into this part, he's going to talk really about temptation. They have this doctrine in the first century that says, well, if I'm doing good, then good things will happen to me. If I'm doing bad, bad things are happening to me. In fact, it's called the Yetzer Hara. And it was the same doctrine that we might see in the book of Job. And in the book of Job, we would say that the friends of Job would say, well, you know, you're getting all this punishment of this physical trials because you're doing something wrong or you're doing something bad. And so when you do bad things, then God's going to bring bad things upon you. But in fact, we know that that's not the case. And James makes that point here. He says that, here, I want you to understand this. He says, let no one say, when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. So he points this fact out that's very prudent. It's very prominent. It's like, okay, well, we would understand the fact that God, God is good. God is love. That if God is good, God is not evil. That God couldn't produce evil things. That God wouldn't do evil things. And so he might say, I'm being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil. We would expect that type of thing. But this doctrine, well, God tempts me. God brings me into this trial. God brings me. No, he doesn't. He says, because he can't be tempted by evil things. He can't produce evil things. He can't bring evil. He won't bring evil things upon his people. You know what? In fact, it says that God will test you, right? That in the beginning of these trials or these temptations or these things that you're dealing with, you're being tested as a Christian. Trials are just a test for who we are as people. How trusting are you going to be in God when a trial comes in your life that you don't know how to deal with? How trusting are you going to be when you face a temptation that you don't know how to deal with? What are you going to do when you face a temptation that you don't know how to deal with? Who are you going to go to? What are you going to do? What's your action? What's your response for this particular thing? And so James points this out. He says that God cannot tempt people with evil, nor does God tempt people. But he gives us the answer. He tells us what it is. he says, but each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. I mean, it makes perfect sense, right? God would say, you know what? You sin because of yourself. It's not because anybody tempts you. It's not because anybody forces you to do it. But guess what? You're tempted when you're lured, right? When you're lured and enticed by that desire that dwells within you as a human. You might be tempted to do something you know is wrong. You might be willing to do something you know is wrong, even when you know it's wrong. And look, I understand. No human is perfect. And I just want to see a show of hands of everybody who thinks they're perfect. Okay, good. But here's what he's saying. He says, it's you. It's your problem. You're lured and you're enticed by your own desire. Nobody makes you do this. God doesn't lure this. God doesn't do this. And in fact, he's going to tell us in the following verses what God really is going to do. And so verse 15, he said, then, right, follow this desire. Desire, when it has conceived, right, when desire ruptures within the individual, when desire comes upon what we're dealing with, then it gives birth to sin. And when sin is conceived, and when it is sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Right? James is saying, I'm planting this on you. This is your own desire, your own problems, your own difficulties, your own thing that you're dealing with as an individual. That it's not somebody who forces you to do something. It's not somebody who brings us into the realm. And I think that James is making this point too, that God tests. He never tempts. He tests us. He doesn't tempt us. He tests us. But he also wants us to know that temptation is completely upon us. What we choose to do with temptation is completely upon our own understanding. And so he might say that it starts with desire, right? A want, a need. I want something, I desire something. We might look at, go back to the Garden of Eden where Eve desired to be like God. And so her desire was what drove her to sin. The temptation was manifested by the desire that she had to be like God, right? So desire then goes to this idea of temptation, right? Once this desire is manifested itself, there's this temptation that looms within the human. And then once that temptation is fully grown, this desire starts to build within the individual, then it becomes sin. You see the contrast between temptation and sin? Temptation is not a sin. Temptation might be a thought. Temptation is not something that's a sin. Temptation is something that leads to sin, right? Temptation, we would say, in order for there to be sin, desire must be carried out. In fact, we have to act on a particular temptation in order for that temptation to be a sin. And I think that's what James is pointing out here. He's telling them that, in order for sin to be what sin is, or in order for temptation to have any effect on human individuals, desire has to be carried out amongst us. And so, if we're going to understand this properly, we have to understand that it's our own desire that causes us to sin. The fact that you're responsible for your own sin. That you're responsible for your own life. You're responsible for what you do and what you don't do. You're responsible for whether or not you act on a temptation that's in your life or whether or not you don't act on a temptation that's within your life. And taking responsibility for our sin and understanding that God is ready and willing to forgive if we're ready and willing to acknowledge the fact that it is our own self that's dealt with this problem. And so he wants them not to be deceived. He's like, look, you have to understand that God is not someone that tempts people. God is not someone that's going to bring you, he's not going to be tempted by evil, and he's not going to bring evil upon anybody. He says, don't be deceived. Don't delude yourself. Don't deceive what you're seeing here. But that every good and perfect gift is from above. Right? Every good thing, every perfect thing that you have in your life comes from God. Every blessing that you have comes from God. Right? It's not that God is the individual, this big scary monster in the sky, but he's a father who wants to have a relationship with you. He's an individual who's trying to help you make good life choices. And he's someone who gives good and perfect gifts, coming down from the Father of lights. with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow due to change. And so in other words, what James is saying is that God has not changed his mentality over time. God is, there's no variation. God is the same today, yesterday, and always. There's nothing that changes with God. God still expects the same thing. God still understands that we as humans struggle with this type of sin. But we have to also understand about God is that he's not going to change on you. Well, all of a sudden, now you can do whatever you want. God still expects the same thing out of people who choose to follow his son. So 118. This is where we get into the real stuff. He says, of his own will, he brought us forth by the word of truth that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creature. Right? In other words, God didn't lead us into temptation. He didn't bring us into evil, but he bestowed a blessing upon humanity. You know, the only punishment that man received for sinning in the garden was they were cast out of the garden and they were no longer allowed to be with God. But other than that, God blessed his people. Be fruitful and multiply is a blessing to the people, right? He says, the fact that you sin and God still does this is incredible. Of his own will. Not of somebody else's will, not of somebody else's timetable, but of God's will. He brought us forth by this word of truth, by this promise that he placed amongst his people, that we should be a kind of first fruits among his people. So what do we do when we deal with temptation? Who do we blame? Who do we help? What do we do when we feel this overwhelming desire to do something that we know we shouldn't do? And I think I have the answer. I'm not saying that this is the magic to stop sin, but I feel like it's helped me, and it's going to help you too. Whenever you're faced with a situation, I mean, you could say, I'm going to hit the pause button. Right? Because a lot of times when we sin because, well, we're not really thinking. We just do it. We act that fast. We don't really think about what we're doing. We're just saying, I want to do that thing, and there's nothing really to stop us from committing that sin. And you know what? It happens. But if we hit the pause button, if we say, you know what? I'm going to stop here. And I'm going to think about what I'm doing. I'm going to pause, right? I'm going to pause with whatever this temptation is, with whatever this sin is that I'm about to commit. I'm going to pause with what I'm doing, and I'm going to try to do something else. Once I pause, then I'm going to question what I'm doing. I'm going to question, well, what am I dealing with here? Can I avoid this sin? And then the third thing that I try to do is distract. I try to distract myself, right? If you distract yourself from something, okay, well, I'm dealing with this temptation. This is really urgent. I'm really going to do this. And if you can distract yourself, if you can pause, if you can think, if you can question, if you can distract yourself from that sin, it'll help you avoid sin. Now, I'm not telling you that this is a recipe to stop yourself from sinning, because you're going to deal with sin the rest of your life. You're going to deal with sin your entire life. You're never not going to sin. But that's the beauty of living in God's grace, is that God one day is going to come back and he's going to bring those who were trusting in him to live in his kingdom, to live in his new creation. And that's the beauty of it. If we can pause. But this is to help us. You know, we're trying not to sin. You know, we're not just sinning and saying, oh, well, God, forgive me. No, we're trying not to sin. We're trying not to do what's wrong. We're trying not to do what's immoral. We're trying not to give in to these temptations and these desires that dwell within the natural man. And we're trying to move forward. So, here's a couple of things that I like to think about. Sin can be avoided if we recognize the temptation and dismantle it before it turns into sin. Right? We can avoid sin if we can recognize temptation and dismantle it. Take it apart. Say, you know what? I'm going to pause. I'm going to question. I'm going to distract. I'm going to pause. I'm going to question. I'm going to distract. Right? I'm going to pause. I'm going to question. I'm going to distract. That's how you dismantle this idea. It's not going to work every time. It's not going to be, this, but it'll help. It'll help when you're in those situations. Instead of just acting like kind of our Americans, we just react. James's people, they're just reacting. They're just reacting to everything. This is what it is. This is what it shouldn't be. we're trying not to react, but to respond with wisdom. Secondly, the way to defeat temptation is to practice self-control. If we're being real about it, we don't practice a lot of self-control in our country, do we? We don't practice a lot of, we overdo, we over-excess almost everything, right? We buy too much, we eat too much, we do too much all the time because we have excess, we live in excess, right? And it's hard for us even as Christians to live a life of self-control. If we're going to defeat temptation, we've got to practice self-control. That's what this is all about. That's what pausing, questioning, and distracting is all about. It's about practicing self-control. I can control. You can control yourself. You don't think that you can't control yourself. I think that's the fallacy that the word puts out. Well, I can't control what I'm doing. Yes, you can. You can control everything you're doing. You can control every action that you make. You can control how you deal with every temptation. It's completely upon you with how you deal with that particular sin. And so the lesson is yours tonight. I hope that you've learned something. I hope that, this week that you'll practice these three things. You come upon a temptation, you come upon a sin. Because, you know what, here's the thing. Imagine what the church would look like if people paused before they sinned. Imagine the amount of hurt it could save the world if we paused, we questioned, and we distracted before we dealt with sin. Tonight we're going to sing a song of encouragement, and as is our custom here, we offer an invitation for those who feel the need to respond. So if you're going to do that, we would ask that you would come and do as we stand and as we sing.